They never told you that beneath the most elegant Victorian gowns, a living body sometimes hid in the dark. The dresses were praised, the soirees admired, yet no one spoke of the breath held under layers of steel and silk. Beauty was a performance, and someone paid for it with silence. Tonight, you will walk into that world and feel the weight that history refused to carry. So, before you feel comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel only if your heart truly wants to. If you do like it, leave a little comment letting me know what time it is where you are. Now, dim the lights. Adjust the pillow to fit your head. Maybe turn on a fan to create a relaxing atmosphere. And let's begin this journey together tonight. If anyone were to wander into a Victorian ballroom with nothing but admiration for its polished beauty, they might believe every detail reflected grace rather than the strain that held it together. The chandeliers glowed with a practiced warmth, casting soft circles of light onto the polished floor. Strings of music drifted gently above the crowd, shaping a rhythm that seemed to belong to a world unharmed by struggle. Women stood in gowns that billowed like soft clouds, their expressions composed, their gestures measured with precision. From afar, it all appeared serene, a realm where elegance was effortless, and refinement was simply the way life unfolded. Yet the longer one observed, the more the seams of that illusion began to show. The silk, the poise, the carefully timed laughter were layers placed over the truth, much like the fabric that hid what no guest was meant to see. Victorian society was built on contrast brilliance, on the surface burden underneath. Decorum for the elite, discomfort for those who sustained it. The ballroom looked like a sanctuary of privilege, but the air around it carried the faint trace of unseen labor of lives, pressed out of sight so the wealthy could shine. The women who moved through the room appeared untouched by effort. Their skirts glided with an unnatural smoothness, rounded and full, as though the fabric itself possessed a will to float. Guests admired these silhouettes, the way one might admire architectural marvels, grand, precise, and seemingly self-supported. But no gown of that magnitude behaved naturally. The structure beneath was a cage of steel hoops and fabric straps heavy enough to restrict breath, stiff enough to bruise skin. It demanded adjustment, stability, and constant care. And during certain events, when expectations were painfully high, the structure demanded much more than that. It demanded another person hidden inside it. Unseen by any of the attendees, some gowns were engineered not only to shape a woman's figure, but to conceal a body beneath the layers. A maid, usually small, young, and trained to be silent, would crouch within the steel frame to steady it from inside. Her hands pressed lightly against the fabric, her back arched in an unnatural curve, her breath measured so it would not disturb the illusion. She became the invisible core of the silhouette, essential, yet erased from every memory of the night. This practice was never acknowledged openly. It slipped between conversations, existing only in the quiet exchanges behind closed doors. Mistresses issued instructions without emotion, as though assigning a task no different from mending a hem. Maids obeyed because they had no alternative. And when the ballroom doors opened, the arrangement dissolved into silence. Only the wearer knew, and even she preferred not to think about the cramped figure hidden beneath her grandeur. The crowd, oblivious, admired the spectacle. Men bowed with measured confidence. Women exchanged glances shaped by habit rather than warmth. Their eyes lingered on the width of a skirt, the smoothness of its curve, the perfect symmetry as it turned under candlelight. Not one of them imagined a human presence beneath the shimmering folds, a body forced to keep still for hours, while the world above it celebrated. Servants stationed at the edges of the room noticed, though they never spoke. Their eyes tracked each gown with the instinct that came from long observation. They knew which skirts hid a maid and which did not. They knew how long each hidden girl would be confined and how much weight she carried. They saw the strain that no one else cared to notice. The slight tremor when the wearer shifted too fast. The faint tightening of fabric when the maid inside fought to remain steady. But their understanding remained unspoken, swallowed by the hierarchy that governed every corner of the hall. Victorian society thrived on contradictions. It cherished the illusion of purity while depending on the labor it refused to acknowledge. It praised beauty yet exploited invisible bodies to maintain it. It valued propriety, though it relied on secrecy to prevent its fragile image from cracking. The spectacle of a ballroom represented order and sophistication, but beneath its polished glow lay shadows shaped by neglect, silence, and the quiet endurance of those forced to remain unseen. The era was proud of its refinement, proud of the moral codes it claimed to uphold, But no moral code stopped a maid from being folded beneath a gown her existence reduced to a stabilizing force. No ethical standard prevented a young girl from being told her discomfort mattered less than appearance. The ballroom was the ideal reflection of a society that prized beauty, while burying the cost of that beauty under layers of silk and steel. From a distance, nothing seemed out of place. The gowns gleamed, the dancers glided, and the music softened every corner of the room. But closer inspection revealed a truth that lingered like dust trapped in lamplight, always present, rarely acknowledged. Beauty was not merely crafted, it was extracted often from the bodies of those who would never stand among the dancing figures. In this world, contradiction was not a flaw, it was the foundation. Elegance lived side by side with exploitation, and the former could not exist without the latter. The ballroom stood as proof of that, a glittering stage built upon shadows that no one wished to name. The calm brilliance of the gathering held itself together only because its darker edges were carefully hidden from sight. A subtle shift beneath the fabric begins to reveal a deeper layer behind the quiet shine of the ballroom, and one might start to wonder what truths remain concealed beneath the sweeping shape of those magnificent gowns. The gowns, worn in Victorian evening halls, carried a weight that went far beyond their ornate appearance. Layers of silk, taffeta, muslin, and underskirts pressed against one another in a carefully calculated arrangement, creating a silhouette that was admired precisely because it looked effortless. Yet nothing about these gowns was natural. Every fold, every curve, every sweep of fabric demanded an internal structure strong enough to hold it in place, and the body wearing it had to adapt to its demands rather than the other way around. The impression of softness concealed an engineering challenge that could strain even the most experienced dressmaker. At the core of each gown lay the crinoline or cage skirt, a construction of steel hoops connected by vertical tapes, forming a shape that widened the wearer's body far beyond its natural boundaries. The steel rings were heavy enough to leave bruises, but fragile enough to bend out of alignment with a single misstep. Dressmakers reinforced them with stitching, padding, and interlaced bands. But the structure always required constant attention. If one hoop shifted, the entire skirt changed shape. If one tape loosened, the carefully groomed silhouette collapsed. The gown did not simply sit on the body. It imposed itself upon it, dictating posture and movement with quiet authority. The layers above the cage were equally demanding. Fabric was arranged to fall in long, controlled waves, creating a smooth outer surface that concealed the mechanical core beneath. This required pinning, folding, and stitching done with mathematical precision. A misaligned pleat could distort the entire appearance, and a single crease could ruin the illusion of flawless elegance. Seamstresses spent hours ensuring the outer fabric draped just right, checking the fall of light across its surface, adjusting tiny sections until the gown behaved as though it were sculpted rather than sewn. Despite the weight of these constructions, women were expected to move as though nothing burdened them. Every step had to be practiced. Turning required calculation. Bending was nearly impossible. Sitting involved lowering oneself onto the very edge of a chair, while maintaining balance so the skirt would not tilt awkwardly. If the gown shifted even slightly out of alignment, the wearer risked exposing the underlying structure or ruining the symmetry that society admired so deeply. Everything from walking through a doorway to descending a staircase became a measured performance. Support was always necessary. Often, the weight of the gown pulled backward, forcing the wearer to stand with a slight lean just to maintain equilibrium. The bodice cinched tightly around the torso, restricted breathing, and encouraged stillness. The combination of steel fabric and compression created a rigid shell that dictated how the upper and lower bodies could interact with each other. Even small tasks, such as turning the head or lifting an arm, required awareness of how the gown would respond. Women did not simply wear these creations, they surrendered to them. Behind the scenes, maids played a crucial role in managing the complexity of these garments. Before a woman entered a ballroom, her maids tightened the bodice, checked the cage for damage, lifted each layer of fabric to inspect for irregularities, and guided her into the gown piece by piece. Once the wearer stood fully dressed, the maids circled her like quiet sentinels, adjusting folds, tugging at ribbons, straightening hems. They knew the precise distribution of weight and how easily balance could be lost. Their work had to be perfect because in Victorian society, a single imperfection could call into question not just beauty but propriety. Once the wearer stepped out into the public eye, the fragility of the gown's perfection became even clearer. A sudden draft could lift the outer layer in the wrong direction, revealing too much of the cage beneath. The brush of another woman's skirt could distort the shape. Even the slightest collision could cause the hoops to tremble, a movement visible to anyone standing nearby. The wearer had to respond immediately, shifting her weight, adjusting her posture, or quietly signaling a maid to intervene. To maintain the illusion of ease constant vigilance was required. The structure of these gowns also dictated the social environment. Large skirts forced physical distance between people, creating an artificial boundary that controlled how one moved through a room. Doorways became obstacles. Narrow corridors became hazards. When multiple women walked together, their skirts collided like unwieldy machinery. Every gathering required spatial awareness, and every ballroom had to accommodate the exaggerated dimensions of its guests. Society embraced these shapes not because they were practical, but because they symbolized status. Only those with means could manage such burdens. The gown's complexity extended beyond mechanics into symbolism. Its weight reflected the burden of societal expectations. Its rigid structure a mirror of the rigid moral standards imposed on women. The wearer bore the responsibility of upholding an ideal of elegance, and any failure fell squarely on her shoulders. The gown was a physical reminder that she was always on display, always judged, always required to maintain control, even when her own movement was constrained. Behind every graceful appearance lay an unseen difficulty. The elegance admired from across the room was sustained by discomfort, discipline, and the invisible labor of those who prepared the gown. A Victorian evening dress was not merely clothing. It was architecture worn on the body, designed to impress, but capable of overwhelming anyone who stepped inside it. Every detail of the gown's grandeur relied on structures that demanded constant mastery. Yet beyond its polished surface lies another dimension shaped by hidden strain and silent effort. And it is within that strained stillness that the darker truths of these garments begin to reveal themselves. The servants who moved through Victorian households existed in a silence so deep that even their footsteps seemed to dissolve before reaching the floor. Their presence was essential, yet their existence was treated as incidental, something that filled the spaces between wealth and appearance without ever being acknowledged. Maids were responsible for every detail of preparation long before a single guest entered a ballroom. They tightened laces, lifted layers of fabric, checked seams for weaknesses, and corrected the subtle distortions caused by the weight of steel and cloth. Their hands stabilized what society celebrated, ensuring that the women they dressed could glide through the evening without being burdened by the physical demands of their attire. These maids understood the architecture of gowns better than anyone who wore them. They knew how the cage skirt shifted when the wearer moved too quickly, how a loose ribbon could tilt an entire silhouette, and how sweat trapped beneath layers of fabric could cause the bodice to cling where it should not. They anticipated problems before they occurred, predicting how the dress would behave under the strain of dancing, walking, or simply standing in a crowded room. Their expertise, however, was never recognized as skill. It was simply expected absorbed into the background of daily life, invisible even to those who depended on it completely. As the evening approached, the maids worked with quiet urgency. They moved around their mistress with a practiced rhythm, adjusting, fastening, lifting, smoothing. The transformation from an ordinary figure into a spectacle of wealth could take hours, and the maids performed each step with precision. Once the final layer settled into place, the mistress would glance briefly into the mirror, often without acknowledging the effort behind her reflection. The maids who had shaped every part of that image stepped back into the shadows, waiting for the next instruction. When the doors to the ballroom opened, the maids vanished from sight. Their absence was intentional, woven into the social rules that defined the upper class. A servant's presence during a grand event was considered a disruption, a reminder of the labor that sustained the illusion of effortless beauty. They were expected to disappear completely, slipping into back rooms, corridors, and service areas where their work could continue unseen. Even if they needed to intervene, whether to fix a dress, steady a cage, skirt, or assist with a sudden mishap, they had to do so with the precision of a shadow appearing and retreating without drawing attention. The invisibility required of them was more than physical. It was a condition of their existence. They could not speak freely, could not raise their eyes without permission, could not reveal exhaustion or frustration. Their identities dissolved into function, their names often forgotten beyond the household walls. Guests rarely knew who dressed the women they admired, who tightened the corsets that made breathing difficult, or who mended the fabric torn during dancing. To acknowledge the servant behind the elegance would have broken the spell that Victorian society worked so hard to maintain. Yet, even as they remained unseen, The maids carried the weight of responsibility for every moment of the evening. A slipping hem, a misaligned hoop, or a sag in the skirt could reflect poorly on the woman wearing the gown, and by extension on the household. The blame would never fall on the dressmaker or the materials. It would fall on the maid. The pressure to maintain perfection was constant, pressing against them as heavily as the steel frames pressed against the bodies of the women they dressed. Their invisibility extended into the rituals surrounding the ball. They prepared the gowns, adjusted the jewelry, and fastened shoes before the first guest arrived. But once the event began, they slipped through hidden passages, listening for subtle cues that their assistance might be needed. A faint tug at a fold of fabric, a slight disturbance in the movement of a skirt, a quiet signal from their mistress. All of these were moments when the maid would appear correct. The issue with quick, careful hands and then vanish again before anyone registered her presence. The entire system rested on the belief that servants should remain unnoticed. To be seen was to disrupt the order, to remind guests that the glamour before them was built on labor and sacrifice. Maids were trained to erase themselves from the narrative, to become extensions of the household rather than people with lives and experiences of their own. Their disappearance during the ball was not an accident. It was an expectation. Despite the relentless demand for invisibility, the maids observed everything. They saw the cracks beneath the elegant facade, the moments when dresses strained against the bodies trapped inside them, the expressions of discomfort masked by polite smiles. They knew the effort it took to maintain the illusion and understood how fragile it truly was. Their work required not just skill, but an intimate understanding of both the garments and the people who wore them. In the end, the maids shaped the beauty that others admired, while receiving no acknowledgement for their labor. They were the quiet architects of elegance, unseen yet indispensable, supporting a world that refused to recognize their presence. Their absence in the ballroom was not a lack of contribution, but a reflection of the social hierarchy that valued display over honesty, appearance over reality. Every graceful entrance depended on hands that were never meant to be noticed. Yet beneath the calm exterior of the ballroom, those quiet figures shaped the flow of every movement. Somewhere within that silence, a hidden truth waited for anyone willing to look past the surface. Hidden roles in Victorian society did not always exist in the distant corners of a household. Sometimes they were concealed only inches away from polished shoes and swirling skirts. Beneath the wide frames of crinoline gowns, where candlelight could not reach and air barely moved, a young maid might be positioned in perfect stillness. Her task was not to serve tea, carry trays, or sweep corridors. Instead, she became a living support, an unseen stabilizer whose body ensured that a gown maintained its flawless shape through the long hours of an evening celebration. What appeared effortless on the surface often relied on a quiet sacrifice hidden entirely from view. These moments began long before the doors to a ballroom opened. Preparations demanded precision, and for gowns chosen specifically to impress the internal structure had to be flawless. Some dresses were too heavy, too prone to shifting, or too elaborate to rely solely on their steel cage. The slightest tilt could distort the silhouette, exposing the fragile engineering beneath. To prevent this, a maid, usually the smallest, lightest, and most compliant, was instructed to slip inside the space formed by the crinoline hoops. Once there, she curled herself into a position that allowed her hands or back to hold the frame steady without disturbing its shape. Her world became the narrow, enclosed space beneath layers of fabric. The smell of starch and dust filled the air around her. The steel hoops pressed against her limbs, and the fabric brushed her face whenever the wearer moved. She could not sit fully upright, nor could she shift her weight freely. Every muscle had to remain tense enough to maintain balance, yet still enough to avoid detection. Her breath had to be silent, shallow, and controlled. Inside that dark shell, time stretched slowly, marked only by the faint vibrations of footsteps and music filtering through the fabric. Above her, the ballroom carried on in its luminous rhythm. Guests admired the perfection of the gown without realizing what sustained it. They complimented the curve of the skirt, the way it held its shape, even when the wearer danced or turned. From their perspective, the gown was a triumph of fashion, a testament to the dressmaker's skill and the mistress's taste. But none of them knew that each smooth motion required someone beneath the cloth adjusting weight and tension to prevent the structure from collapsing or tilting out of alignment. The wearer herself often gave no outward sign that someone was beneath her gown. She learned to move with small gestures that did not disturb the hidden presence below. A slight pause before turning a measured step when approaching a table. a controlled sway during conversation. These minor adjustments helped mask the maid's efforts. For the lady, maintaining the illusion was an expectation. For the maid, maintaining it was a necessity. A single misstep could draw attention to the unusual stability of the skirt, and discovery meant punishment, dismissal, or humiliation for the servant, who had no choice in the matter. The confined space beneath the crinoline did not allow for rest. The maid could not shift her position or stretch her legs. Heat accumulated beneath the fabric, making the air heavy and difficult to breathe. If the lady moved abruptly, the maid had to brace herself to prevent the cage from shaking. The steel pressed harder against her arms and legs as she fought to keep her balance. Pain built gradually, muscles tightening joints, aching, breath thinning. Yet she remained silent, because silence was the condition of her presence. Many servants recalled that the darkest challenge was not the physical strain, but the awareness of being so close to the world above, while being entirely excluded from it. Through the narrow gaps between fabrics, they could sometimes glimpse the flicker of light, or the moving shadows of guests' feet. Laughter echoed, faintly muffled by layers of cloth. The maid heard conversations but could never respond, watched movement but could never join, existed within the center of the gown yet remained erased from the night unfolding around her. She became part of the garment rather than part of the gathering. Still, the task demanded a form of precision that few acknowledged. To hold the skirt in perfect symmetry, the maid learned to anticipate each weight shift. She memorized the rhythm of her mistress's steps, adjusted to the pacing of the dance, and braced herself whenever the gown brushed near obstacles. Her presence was essential for maintaining elegance, yet the success of her work depended on her ability to go unnoticed. The paradox was cruel. The more skillfully she performed, the more invisible she became. Occasionally, when the mistress paused at the edge of the ballroom, the maid could catch a brief moment to breathe. The fabric loosened slightly, or the pressure on her back eased for a few seconds. But these moments were fleeting. The evening demanded movement, and the gown demanded stability. The maid had no choice but to continue. Hours passed in darkness and heat, as she held the shape of a garment admired by people who never considered what allowed it to appear so perfect. What made this practice particularly chilling was the normalization of it. No one questioned why a gown remained perfectly round, despite sharp turns or sudden stops. No one wondered why certain silhouettes never seemed to shift, even when the room grew crowded. In a society determined to preserve its illusions, the truth hid easily under layers of cloth. The maid was not considered a person in those moments. She was part of the machinery of elegance, an invisible support whose suffering sustained the image of refinement. When the evening finally ended and the mistress returned to her chambers, the maid emerged from the gown, stumbling stiff and drenched in sweat. Her limbs ached from maintaining stillness, her vision blurred from hours without light, yet no one asked whether she was hurt or exhausted. Her task was viewed as ordinary, a silent contribution to the grandeur of the night, and by the next event she might be asked to do it again. The flawless shape, admired by the crowd, relied on a body concealed in unbearable stillness. Beneath the wide circle of fabric, labor and suffering quietly anchored every movement above. A deeper truth lingered in the hidden weight that elegance demanded, but never acknowledged. Perfection in Victorian society was not simply expected. It was watched, measured, and judged with a scrutiny that left little room for error. Every woman who stepped into a ballroom carried the weight of an unspoken demand. Her appearance had to withstand the constant attention of those around her. Eyes drifted toward every shift of fabric, every change in posture, every detail that betrayed even a momentary lapse in composure. The gown she wore was not a garment, but a declaration, and any imperfection, no matter how small, became a silent accusation against her upbringing, her manners, and her worth. The expectations extended far beyond beauty. A lady's social standing is intertwined with the precision of her appearance. If her gown lost its shape or seemed to sag, whispers followed. If the fabric tilted more to one side, guests interpreted it as carelessness. The slightest wrinkle, the faintest collapse of a pleat, or even a momentary imbalance, became evidence of a flaw in her character. In a society driven by appearances, dignity depended on how well one could maintain the illusion of effortless grace, while trapped within the rigid confines of a gown that resisted movement at every turn. Maintaining this illusion required meticulous care. Behind the seemingly fluid motion of each woman was an invisible choreography, a sequence of practiced gestures meant to keep the structure of the gown intact. Each step had to be calculated to avoid disturbing the hoop skirt. Each turn had to be controlled so the fabric did not sway unnaturally. Even raising an arm to greet someone risked shifting the delicate balance, holding the silhouette together. The perfection admired by onlookers was the result of physical restraint, constant awareness, and a quiet tension that never eased throughout the evening. Yet even the most practiced women could not prevent the gown from responding to the unpredictability of a crowded room. A sudden push from someone passing behind her, a too sharp pivot while dancing, or the brief collision of skirts could distort the shape. When this happened, the threat of embarrassment loomed instantly. A gown that faltered suggested a woman who could not maintain control, and control was a virtue revered in the upper class. To prevent such moments, assistance was required swift, discreet, and untraceable. This was where the maids invisible to society, yet indispensable to it, quietly intervened. They watched from the periphery, attuned to every slight disruption in a gown's movement. A subtle tilt in the skirt signaled a problem. A ripple that travelled in the wrong direction meant action was needed. When the mistress offered the faintest signal, the maid stepped forward, hands moving with silent precision. A gentle pull, a subtle adjustment beneath the layers, a careful repositioning of fabric, all accomplished in seconds before she slipped away again. But some gowns demanded attention, not just occasionally but continuously. Their size, weight, or construction made them prone to collapse without constant reinforcement. In these cases, perfection required more than external assistance. It required someone beneath the fabric, hidden from sight, maintaining the shape from within. The maid inside the gown bore the responsibility of preventing embarrassment, adjusting her posture, bracing her limbs, and pushing lightly against the steel hoops whenever the gown threatened to falter. She reacted to every movement the mistress made, absorbing strain so that the world above her remained unaware of the fragile balance they shared. For the lady wearing the gown, the pressure never disappeared. Every gesture she made was a negotiation with the structure surrounding her. She felt the tightness of the bodice, restricting her breath, the pull of the skirt dictating her steps, and the subtle tremors when the maid beneath her shifted weight to stabilize the shape. She could not show discomfort, for discomfort implied imperfection. Her smile, her posture, her stillness, everything required maintenance. To falter was to invite judgment, and in a society where reputation shaped destiny, judgment could not be risked. For the maid, the pressure was of a different nature, but no less severe. Her existence beneath the gown was defined by stillness, silence, and submission. She felt the world move above her, heard conversations muffled by fabric, sensed the weight shifts each time her mistress changed direction. She knew that if she failed to keep the gown steady, the consequences would fall upon her alone. No guest would ever know she existed, but the household would see her as the cause of the failure. Hidden labor carried visible blame. The combined strain on both women, one displayed and one concealed, revealed the deep contradictions of Victorian society. Perfection was demanded yet impossible without the suffering of those who upheld it. Elegance was admired yet built on discomfort. The very ideal that defined upper-class femininity required constant correction, constant vigilance, and the silent endurance of bodies forced into unnatural roles. In a ballroom filled with candlelight and music, the illusion of beauty floated through the air, drawing admiration. But beneath that illusion lay tension, fear, and exhaustion. A gown that appeared perfectly shaped was often supported by a fragile system of labor discipline and hidden bodies working in the shadows. Perfection was not a state. It was an ongoing struggle waged quietly and continuously unseen by those who benefited from it. Every flawless moment was sustained by pressure that neither the crowd nor the wearer could openly acknowledge. Behind the stillness of each elegant figure lay a chain of effort that risked unraveling with the smallest mistake. Within that delicate tension, the cost of maintaining such beauty waited to be seen by anyone willing to look closer. The crinoline was often admired as one of the great innovations of Victorian fashion, a remarkable structure that transformed the silhouette of women into sweeping bell-shaped forms. To the casual observer, it seemed like a triumph of elegance, light, floating, and impossibly wide. But its beauty concealed a construction far more severe than the fabric it supported. The crinoline was made of steel hoops, arranged in descending circles held together by vertical bands that shaped the frame into a hollow bell. It expanded a woman's presence in the room, defining her appearance before she even spoke. Yet it also created a space beneath the gown, that few ever imagined could hold more than air. Inside that steel cage was a void large enough for a small person to curl into. The hoops stretched outward, far beyond the natural boundaries of the wearer's body, creating a hollow center designed to bear the weight of layered fabrics without collapsing in on itself. Dressmakers understood the mechanics well. They crafted the structure to distribute force, maintain balance, and resist the constant friction between movement and material. What no one admitted openly, however, was that this same engineering offered a concealed chamber, dark, cramped, and invisible, once fabric fell over it. When multiple layers of petticoats, skirts, and outer fabrics were draped over the crinoline, the structure disappeared entirely. The dense arrangement of cloth prevented light from entering, and the thickness muffled movement and sound. The outside world saw only a smooth, rounded form, perfect in symmetry, untouched by the mechanics beneath. The uniform drape of fabric acted like a veil, hiding every trace of what the steel cage contained. It was this concealment that made the crinoline not just a fashion innovation, but a vessel capable of hiding a living presence. The design of the crinoline required stability, and stability often demanded reinforcement. A single misaligned hoop could distort the gown's shape. A sudden shift in balance could ripple through the layers of fabric. For women attending balls where perfection was non-negotiable, the crinoline's engineering alone was not enough. Someone had to keep that structure steady. The hollow center, originally meant to reduce the weight of the skirts, became the space where a maid could position herself to manage the internal balance of the gown. This possibility was never discussed publicly. It lived in the margins of household knowledge, in quiet instructions, passed from dressmaker to maid, in whispered arrangements, before important events. The mistress never spoke of it, and the guests never knew. But within the private rooms where women prepared for the evening, the crinoline's hollow frame was understood as more than a mechanical support. It was a hiding place, one that served the needs of elegance more effectively than any visible assistant. Inside that cramped space, the maid experienced the gown from an angle no one else could imagine. The steel hoops curved around her like ribs of a cage. The layers of fabric pressed inward, trapping heat and limiting movement. Even when she held perfectly still, the slightest twitch of the mistress above her would send subtle vibrations through the structure. She learned to read those movements, to brace her body against the shifting weight, to push gently against the steel when the gown needed correction. Her presence became an unseen mechanism, a silent component of the garment's architecture. From the outside, nothing betrayed her existence. The gown's wide circumference created distance between the wearer and the world. No one stood close enough to sense the hidden body. The rustle of fabric masked the faintest sound. Candlelight reflected off polished surfaces and shimmering materials, drawing eyes upward toward the beauty of the ensemble rather than downward to the base of the skirt. The maid was shielded entirely by the artifice surrounding her, reduced to a phantom presence whose efforts could never be acknowledged. The engineering of the crinoline solved one problem while creating another. It made dresses larger, grander, and more visually striking, but it also introduced instability that demanded constant vigilance. Instead of eliminating the need for assistance, it shifted that need into the interior of the garment. The structure's hollow spaces and layered coverings allowed society to hide the labor required to maintain elegance. The maid who entered the crinoline became part of the gown's anatomy, her body acting as an internal anchor, a balancing force, a last resort against the failure of an image that had to remain intact. The secrecy of this arrangement reflected the values of the era. Beauty was prized, but the mechanisms behind it were not meant to be seen. Refinement had to look effortless. The more complex the construction of a gown became, the more determined society was to deny the labor beneath it. The crinoline, in its rigid, hollow form, offered the perfect compromise, a structure that allowed a woman to appear untouched by the strain her dress imposed, while creating a hidden chamber for the servant who absorbed that strain for. Just saying, inside that dark shell, the boundary between garment and human blurred. The maid's limbs aligned with the cage, her breath synchronized with the movement of the wearer. She became the silent core that steadied the silhouette, admired by all who looked upon it. No one applauded her endurance. No one questioned how the gown remained so perfectly round. The illusion held because the maid remained unseen, her presence concealed by the very fabric she kept in place. The crinoline was celebrated as a symbol of fashion's progress, yet its design enabled a deeper concealment, one that turned elegance into a structure supported by hidden bodies. It offered beauty to the world while burying the cost of that beauty in silence and darkness. The grandeur of the wide skirt rested upon engineering that welcomed both grace and secrecy. Deep inside its hollow frame, unseen labor shaped the perfection, admired by every watching eye. In that quiet space beneath the layers, a truth persisted that the room above was never meant to witness. Victorian balls were designed to project harmony, elegance, and control. But beneath that polished surface ran a constant undercurrent of physical strain that most attendees pretended not to notice. Women entered these events tightly bound by corsets that compressed their ribs and restricted their breath, creating the narrow waists that society praised as the height of refinement. The pressure of the garment forced the body into a rigid posture, limiting the ability to inhale fully or bend naturally. Hours spent standing, walking, or dancing under such compression often pushed the body past its limits, and fainting spells became an accepted part of the evening. Yet even in these moments of collapse, the illusion of grace had to remain intact. A woman who felt dizziness creeping in could not simply excuse herself or show signs of distress. Instead, she was expected to maintain composure until she could be discreetly guided to a quieter corner. But not every crisis offered time for subtlety. Sometimes the collapse came suddenly, the body giving way under the demands of a corset tightened beyond reason. As the woman swayed her gown, the symbol of her social standing became a burden and a shield. And hidden within that shield, tucked beneath the layers of fabric and steel hoops, a maid waited silently prepared for the moment when she would be needed. The dual purpose of the hidden maid was never spoken aloud. Officially, her presence supported the gown's structure. Unofficially, she was also a first responder in a world that refused to acknowledge its own fragility. From within the dark hollow of the crinoline, she sensed when her mistress's breath grew shallow, when her steps faltered, when the weight above her shifted unnaturally. She learned to listen for changes in rhythm, the dragging of a foot, the sudden tightening of muscles, the faint tremor that signaled the onset of faintness. Though unseen, she was closer to her mistress's physical distress than anyone else could ever be. When a fainting spell struck, the maid acted quickly and silently. She carried small tools of improvised medical care hidden inside the confined space. A pinch of smelling salts wrapped in cloth, a small piece of cool fabric to press against the skin, a tiny flask of water meant only for emergencies. These objects were chosen specifically because they made no sound and could fit into the palm of her hand. Their purpose was not to treat illness fully, but to revive the mistress just enough to keep the illusion intact, enough to allow her to remain standing, walking, or at least maintaining the outward appearance of composure until she could leave the ballroom. From her hidden position, the maid reached upward through the layers of fabric. Her fingers found the inside of the corset's edge, or brushed against the back of the bodice. A slight tug indicated an attempt to loosen the garment by a fraction, just enough to allow a breath of air to reach her mistress's lungs. Sometimes she pressed the cloth lightly against the woman's skin through the layers, providing a momentary coolness to counter the rising heat. Other times, she cracked the smelling salts just beneath the fabric, sending a sharp scent upward without drawing attention. Each action had to be executed in silence, without disturbing the shape of the gown or giving any hint to the onlookers that something was wrong. Above her, the ballroom continued undisturbed. Guests spoke in soft tones, musicians played with steady rhythm, and the lights cast gentle reflections across polished surfaces. No one noticed the faint tremor of a skirt or the subtle pause in a lady's movements. The hidden maid's intervention prevented an embarrassing public scene. A collapse in the center of the ballroom could draw gossip lasting weeks, damaging reputations and inviting scrutiny. The maid's role therefore extended far beyond physical assistance. She protected the social standing of the woman she served, absorbing the weight of responsibility that society placed on appearances. The pressure upon the maid was immense. She had to act quickly enough to prevent disaster, yet subtly enough to go undetected. Her own physical discomfort was irrelevant. What mattered was the preservation of the illusion that surrounded her mistress. She was confined to darkness, bent into an unnatural posture, struggling against heat and lack of air. But she could not show signs of strain. Her work was to save the woman above her from public humiliation, and she had to do so without leaving a trace. In some cases, the maid's actions were the only reason a fainting woman remained upright long enough to exit the room. She stabilized the structure of the gown from within, while the mistress relied on the reprieve granted by the hidden care. Once the doors to the ballroom closed behind them, the woman might slump, gasping for breath, while the maid emerged, trembling and drenched in sweat. Yet no guest, or even most members of the household, ever knew how close the evening had come to unravelling. These hidden medical interventions reflected the strange contradictions of Victorian society. Illness was common, yet acknowledging it in public was considered improper. Women were expected to embody fragile beauty, yet punished if that fragility became visible. The maid beneath the gown became the silent mediator between expectation and reality, performing emergency care that no one would ever admit was necessary. Her presence kept the night moving, kept the image unbroken, kept the illusion alive. The elegant calm of the ballroom relied on quick, unseen hands that caught collapse before it reached the light. Beneath the still fabric, quiet interventions shielded a world determined to deny its own frailty. Within that hidden struggle, the limits of refinement revealed themselves to anyone willing to look beyond the glow. They moved through Victorian households in ways that defied ordinary presence, always there, always watching, yet rarely acknowledged as part of the living structure of the home. Their place existed in the narrow spaces society created for them, behind doors, beneath fabric, within shadows that polite company did not bother to investigate. They were expected to be as unobtrusive as the furniture and as essential as the air that kept the household functioning. These maids learned early that visibility was a risk and attention was a kind of danger. So they trained themselves to occupy silence, to leave no trace of their passing, to ensure their actions left only results, never footprints. Inside the grand rooms where families displayed wealth and refinement, the quiet presence of the maid was felt long before it was seen, if it was ever seen at all. She anticipated needs before they were spoken. She adjusted a curtain half an inch, so the afternoon light would hit her face gently. She replaced a fallen glove before anyone noticed it was missing. She carried out tasks that maintained the delicate balance of appearance, the fragile illusion that everything was effortlessly perfect. Yet when guests arrived, she faded into the edges of vision, retreating to corners where marble and shadow met, becoming part of the unseen machinery that kept the household running. This invisibility took on a different form on nights of celebration, when gowns expanded into sweeping structures of silk and steel. Beneath these extravagant silhouettes, some maids were assigned to roles that blurred the line between servant and ghost. They entered the hollow space inside the crinoline and remained there for hours, contorted into shapes that kept them hidden but ready. Their presence supported the image their mistress presented to the world, maintaining the elegance expected of a family with social standing to protect. The maid inside the gown became an extension of the garment itself, an unseen mechanism holding beauty upright. From within that narrow confinement, she listened to the rhythm of the evening. She learned the slight weight shift that meant her mistress needed balance. She sensed when the gown dipped too low on one side, or when its shape threatened to collapse. Her hands, trained through repetition, corrected these faults from the inside, lifting, pressing, adjusting with movements so subtle they could not be detected even by those standing inches away. The mistress above her remained the picture of grace, unaware or unwilling to acknowledge that the illusion of poise required the constant work of another body hidden beneath the layers. This role demanded absolute stillness and unerring control. A single misjudgment could reveal the truth, exposing both the maid and the mistress to humiliating scrutiny. Society adored beauty but despised the labor behind it. Should the hem ripple in an unexpected pattern, or the shape shift unnaturally, guests might whisper. They might speculate about what the gown concealed, and such speculation could stain a family's reputation, unraveling carefully maintained social ties. The maid understood that her silence protected more than the structure of the dress. It protected the fragile dignity of those who stood above her. Her work extended beyond fabric and structure. She was also expected to intervene when her mistress faltered physically, offering support without drawing attention. If dizziness overcame the woman above, the maid steadied her from inside the gown. If panic rose beneath the corset, the maid softened the moment by shifting her own weight just enough to keep the woman upright. These small interventions prevented visible collapse, preserving the veneer of strength and refinement that the event demanded. In this way, the maid became a stabilizing force, the last barrier between social order and potential embarrassment. No one spoke of these tasks. The mistress never introduced the maid who spent an evening crouched beneath her, nor did guests wonder how the flawless silhouette remained so perfectly shaped through hours of movement. The maid's anonymity was not accidental, it was required. To be noticed was to risk dismissal. To be acknowledged was to break the illusion. So the maid accepted a life where her existence was most valued when it was least visible. The family depended on her discretion, on her ability to vanish into the background until action was needed, and then vanish again. Despite the silence surrounding them, these maids shaped the reputation of the households they served. Their hands prevented wardrobe disasters that could spark gossip across the social circles of the city. Their vigilance shielded mistresses from fainting spells that could become stories told in drawing rooms for weeks. They carried the burden of maintaining a family's polished image, while receiving none of the recognition associated with that labor. Their contributions were erased the moment the event ended, absorbed into the myth of effortless elegance. To outsiders, the household shone with refinement and order. To those within its walls, the truth was more complicated. Beneath the surface lay a network of invisible labor that made the outward appearance possible, and at the center of that network stood the maid, whose work was so essential it had to remain hidden. They called her the ghost beneath the gown, not because she was unreal, but because her presence was never meant to be seen. Every polished gathering rested on the silent endurance of figures who moved without leaving signs of themselves. Behind each display of grace stood labor that society relied upon yet refused to acknowledge. In that quiet tension, another layer of secrecy waited for anyone willing to notice what the glittering rooms concealed. Silence was not simply a rule for the maids hidden within Victorian households. It was the condition of their survival. The expectation extended far beyond speaking or making noise. It governed the sound of their breath, the shifting of their weight, the faint rustle of fabric, and even the quiet tremor of fatigue that ran through their muscles after hours of stillness. For the maid concealed beneath a gown, silence became a discipline, learned through repetition, a reflex honed until her body obeyed commands that denied its own limits. Any trace of her presence risked destroying the illusion her mistress depended upon, and the cost of even the smallest slip was swift and irreversible. Within the confined space of the crinoline, breath had to be controlled with unnatural precision. The maid could not allow her breathing to grow too shallow, lest dizziness overcome her. But she could not allow it to grow too deep either, for the expansion of her chest might shift the gown's structure. She inhaled in measured increments, exhaled with the same quiet restraint, turning each breath into a deliberate act. Over the course of an evening, this careful breathing became a battle against instinct, a test of endurance that few outside the servant class ever imagined. Noise, even the faintest kind, could expose her presence. A soft cough, a shift of fabric, the slight thud of a knee, adjusting any of these, could draw the attention of someone standing nearby. Victorian social events were crowded, yet the ballroom's acoustics were unforgiving. Music filled the air, but between notes there existed moments of stillness, where whispers, breaths, and fabric movements could be heard. If a maid hidden beneath a gown made a sound at the wrong moment, the illusion of effortless refinement could fracture instantly. Guests might turn their heads puzzled. A rumor could begin to form subtle at first, then spread with the ease that only gossip possessed. To prevent this, households developed strict training for young maids, teaching them how to control their movements until their bodies learned to mimic stone. They practiced holding their posture for long periods, practiced shifting weight silently, and practiced adjusting the shape of a gown without allowing its outer form to tremble. Some maids learned to roll their feet in specific patterns, distributing pressure so evenly that even a slight adjustment became invisible. Others learned how to brace themselves against the inner structure of the crinoline, becoming a stabilizing force that corrected the dress from within, without revealing any sign of human presence. The discipline extended beyond the ballroom. Even in the hallways and service areas, maids were taught to walk softly enough that their steps blended into the hum of the household. They learned to avoid creaking floorboards, to memorize the rhythm of the mistress's movements, to anticipate when silence was most crucial. A single mistake, a dropped object, a too loud breath, a misjudged step could lead to immediate dismissal. The household demanded obedience that erased individuality, replacing it with an unbroken surface of quiet efficiency. For the hidden maid, the threat of dismissal carried more than professional consequences. Losing her position could mean losing her home, her income, and her only means of supporting family members who relied on her wages. Many maids came from villages where employment was scarce, where families depended on the few coins sent back each month. A mistake in the ballroom did not simply end a job, it endangered the fragile stability of an entire household. Fear became woven into the silence they maintained, reinforcing their resolve until silence became both habit and burden. Even more challenging was the requirement to avoid shifting the gown above them. The crinoline, though sturdy in appearance, responded to subtle changes in balance. A maid's breathing weight or movement could ripple outward to the fabric, producing a tremor that might catch the eye of a guest. To prevent this, maids trained their bodies to remain steady, even when discomfort became overwhelming. Legs, cramped backs stiffened, and heat collected beneath the layers of fabric. Yet the outward form had to remain steady. They learned to quiet not only their voices, but also their physical impulses, suppressing the natural reactions of the body to maintain the illusion of flawless elegance above them. Over time, some maids became so skilled in silence that their presence was nearly imperceptible even to themselves. They became shadows within shadows, existing only in the narrow space between visibility and absence. The household relied on this mastery of quiet, yet never acknowledged the labor required to achieve it. The mistress glided across the ballroom floor, accepting the admiration directed at her poise, while the maid inside the gown held her breath, counted her movements, and endured the strain that elegance demanded. What made the silence even more severe was the knowledge that it served a purpose far greater than maintaining appearances. It protected the social reputation of the family, shielding them from embarrassment or questions that might unsettle their place within the community. A single exposed maid could unravel years of careful social positioning. Wealth relied on perception, and perception relied on flawless presentation. The maid's silence was therefore not simply a matter of obedience. It was part of a larger structure that preserved the illusion of order and refinement that Victorian society claimed as its greatest virtue. Through this silence, the maid became both invisible and indispensable. Her lack of voice ensured that the voices of those above her remained unchallenged. Her lack of presence ensured that those who occupied the rooms above her could continue believing that beauty required nothing more than the right dress and the right posture. The silence she maintained was a testament to endurance, but also to the unspoken truth that refinement often depended on suffering hidden from view. Her quiet was not emptiness. It was the foundation upon which entire families stood. The stillness surrounding each elegant figure rested on bodies trained to suppress every sound and movement. Behind the polished calm of the ballroom lay discipline that erased those who upheld it. What lingered beneath that controlled quiet hinted at a truth far harsher than the room above ever allowed to be seen. When embroidered gowns swept across the ballroom and women lowered themselves into their seats, the elegance of the moment hid a small but indispensable truth. Even in stillness, the silhouette had to remain perfect. A seated figure was no excuse for the gown to deflate, wrinkle, or lose its carefully sculpted shape. The wide circle of fabric, supported by steel hoops and layered textiles, had to preserve its fullness at all times. Yet the structure that kept a woman's posture lofty while standing did not naturally maintain the same form when she attempted to sit. Without intervention, the gown would collapse inward, revealing how fragile the illusion truly was. To preserve this seamless image, households devised a practice that blurred the boundary between servant and structure. Behind the sweeping arc of the skirt, hidden from the ballroom's view, a maid took her place as the woman prepared to sit. She folded herself into a narrow space near the ground, aligning her body so that her presence would provide the necessary support without bending the external shape. Her knees tucked beneath her, her back curved slightly, she became an internal brace for the gown. To any observer facing the woman, the act appeared effortless. The dress remained full and symmetric, untouched by the gravitational pull that should have changed it. The maid's task required precision. She had to match her movements perfectly with the descent of her mistress. If she positioned herself too early, the gown might shift or create an unnatural angle. If she moved too late, the skirt would momentarily collapse, revealing the trick. Timing was everything. As the mistress lowered herself, the maid pressed upward gently, with her shoulders guiding the fabric into the rounded shape expected of someone of high status. Her hands remained pressed against the internal lining, providing subtle tension that kept the fabric smooth and resistant to wrinkling. Once seated, the mistress appeared serene, her posture lifted, her skirt radiating outward in a flawless arc. She might raise her glass, turn her head to speak with a guest, or rest her hands upon her lap, publicly embodying the refinement for which the evening had been arranged. Meanwhile, behind her, nearly unseen, the maid held her position in silence. She became part of the chair's unseen architecture, wedged between fabric and wood, an invisible hinge that kept the appearance of elegance from collapsing. The demands placed upon the maid's body were severe. The cramped space left little room for adjustment. Her legs cramped quickly, and the heat trapped beneath the heavy layers of fabric pressed against her skin. The position obstructed her breathing, forcing her to inhale shallowly so that her movement would not ripple through the gown. The slightest tremor risked exposing her roll, so she trained herself to maintain stillness, even when her muscles trembled from fatigue. She endured numbness, pressure, and growing discomfort with the understanding that failure carried consequences far beyond physical strain. While the mistress engaged in conversation or observed the room around her, the maid kept her focus inward. She monitored the tension of the fabric, adjusting with the smallest movements when the gown drifted off balance. She counted weight shifts when her mistress leaned forward or reached to the side. Each adjustment had to be invisible, felt only through the controlled pressure of the spine and shoulder. The work required strength, subtlety, and total discretion. The maid knew that the guests who admired the gown's shape would never imagine that another person sat hidden behind it. Society's expectations reinforced the need for this invisible support. A seated woman whose dress collapsed inward might be judged poorly, accused of neglecting her appearance, or lacking the refinement expected of her class. Even small imperfections drew comment. Guests who prided themselves on observing etiquette noticed every detail: the angle of a sleeve, the tilt of a hat, the fullness of a skirt. Each of these details signaled a family's dignity. The maid served as the silent guarantor of that dignity, absorbing discomfort so that her mistress could remain untouched by scrutiny. It was a strange kind of dual existence. Above the gown, the woman maintained an air of composed elegance. Behind the gown, the maid bent her body into a shape never meant for comfort. The distance between the two roles was vast, yet their fates intertwined in that moment. The mistress depended on the maid for her public perfection. The maid depended on silence for her continued survival within the household. Neither acknowledged the other in public, but their bodies were bound together through the mechanisms of the gown. This unspoken arrangement reflected the broader dynamics of Victorian society. Beauty required labor, and labor required invisibility. The maid existed in the narrow space between necessity and erasure, supporting a world that denied her presence, even as it relied on her endurance. Her work remained hidden, her contributions unnamed, her body bent into shapes that preserved the illusion of ease for the woman she served. When the mistress rose from her seat and the gown expanded once more, the maid shifted away, silently resuming her ghost-like path through the household's unseen corridors. The seated elegance, admired by guests, was never as effortless as it appeared. The smooth perfection of each resting figure depended on a body hidden just out of sight. Behind the calm surface, an unnoticed strain kept the illusion from collapsing. In the quiet space between fabric and shadow, another truth hovered beyond the reach of those who never questioned the display before them. Life beneath the ornate gowns of Victorian society unfolded in a darkness few ever imagined. For the maids hidden under layers of silk and steel, time did not pass in the same way it did for the guests above. Hours stretched into an unbroken line of strain and stillness, each minute marked by the growing ache of a position the human body was never meant to hold. While the ballroom shimmered with candlelight and soft music, the world beneath the fabric closed in, trapping the maid in a space so confined that even shifting slightly risked revealing her presence. She occupied a posture built on endurance rather than comfort, knees folded tightly against her chest or pressed into the floor. The spine bent into a curve, dictated by the structure of the gown, shoulders wedged against the inner lining to keep the skirt's shape intact. Muscles protested early, but complaints had no place in this environment. She learned to breathe shallowly to conserve energy and avoid movement. As the hours progressed, numbness spread through her limbs, yet she remained still, her role requiring complete submission to silence. Inside, the gown's interior heat accumulated quickly. The fabric that seemed luxurious from the outside became suffocating as it trapped warm air with no space for circulation. Sweat collected along her skin and soaked into the layers around her, but she could not wipe it away. The stillness she maintained intensified the suffocation, and each breath became a quiet negotiation between necessity and control. The darkness pressed closer, leaving her with only the faintest sense of the world, moving just inches above her head. There was no water to ease her thirst. The hours she spent inside the gown coincided with the most active part of the evening, but she had no access to refreshment or rest. Even swallowing too loudly risked being noticed by those nearby. Her mouth grew dry, her throat tightened, but she endured it with the same resolve she applied to every other discomfort. She understood that her suffering was invisible by design. The mistress she supported had the luxury of sipping drinks and pausing to catch her breath. The maid had no such reprieve. Standing was impossible. The confines of the gown left no room to extend her legs or straighten her back. She remained locked in her contorted position until the event concluded or her mistress left the ballroom. Even then, she had to wait for the appropriate moment to slip away unnoticed through service doors or shadowed hallways. Rising too quickly could disturb the gown, and any sound she made might draw attention. Her freedom depended on perfect timing, and even after escaping the confines of the dress, her body carried the imprint of its shape long into the night. Exhaustion crept in gradually, but sometimes it struck with sudden force. The combination of restricted movement, shallow breathing, heat, and hunger could overwhelm even the most disciplined maid. Some fainted quietly inside the gown, their bodies collapsing inward in a way that risked the entire structure falling out of shape. When this happened, the mistress above often felt a sudden shift. She could not identify a subtle sag in the fabric that told her something was wrong. But she never looked down. She never considered that the stillness keeping her dignified appearance intact depended on another person's endurance. In rare but devastating moments, the maid's collapse went unnoticed until the evening ended. By then, the strain had already taken its toll. These incidents remained unspoken, erased as soon as the ballroom lights dimmed. The household moved forward without acknowledging them, as though such suffering were simply part of the invisible machinery that kept their world orderly. Despite the harshness of their circumstances, maids continued to take on these roles because they had no alternative. Their livelihoods depended on enduring the discomfort no matter how severe. The families they served relied on them to sustain the polished veneer that defined their social identity. If the maid faltered, she risked not only her position, but also her reputation in a society where servants were easily replaced and rarely defended. The cost of failure extended far beyond the ballroom. For many of these women, endurance became a form of survival. They navigated their tasks with a mix of discipline, instinct, and resignation. They understood that their work would never be praised openly, that their presence was intentionally hidden, and that their sacrifice reinforced a structure that excluded them. Yet they persisted, shaping their bodies and minds to withstand demands that did not account for their humanity. There was a certain quiet resignation in their persistence. Each evening they folded themselves into the hollow of a gown, knowing what it required. Each night they bore the strain with the knowledge that no one above them would ever acknowledge their suffering. Their lives remained buried beneath layers of fabric hidden from the world they upheld. The elegance admired in the ballroom depended on unseen endurance buried in darkness. The polished beauty above existed only because someone endured the weight beneath it. Behind each smooth silhouette lay hours of discomfort, erased the moment the night ended. Hints of a deeper truth lingered there, waiting just beyond the reach of those who never questioned the glow above. The grandeur of Victorian fashion rested on a foundation few ever allowed themselves to imagine. Every gown that swept across a ballroom, every silhouette, admired for its symmetry and fullness, depended on more than fabric steel hoops or expert tailoring. Beneath the shining exterior, hidden behind layers of silk and tulle, another body bore the burden of sustaining the illusion. Perfection was not an effortless achievement. It was a weight transferred downward, pressing onto someone who received none of the admiration the dress elicited. The idea that beauty required sacrifice was common in Victorian culture, but few realized that the sacrifice often came from those who never wore the gowns themselves. A gown renowned for its elegance appeared to stand on its own, yet the structure could not maintain its imposing shape without support. Crinolines, though, designed to create space and volume, buckled when strained, shifted when touched, and sagged when the wearer sat or moved unpredictably. The truth was that these dresses required constant reinforcement, and the reinforcement came in the form of human endurance. Maids placed inside or beneath the gowns acted as stabilizing forces, their bodies absorbing the pressure that the design could not withstand. The labor they provided was physical, in a way that contradicted the effortless grace the gowns projected. Inside the hollow structure, created by steel hoops, the maid served as part of the architecture. Her body pressed outward or upward at precise angles to ensure that the silhouette remained consistent. Every shift in her mistress's posture became a cue for instant adjustment. If the wearer leaned too far forward, the maid braced the gown from behind. If she turned sharply, the maid shifted her weight to prevent the fabric from collapsing. In cold rooms, the steel chilled the maid's skin. In warm ones, the layers of fabric trapped suffocating heat. Yet she endured both without complaint, knowing that her discomfort was a requirement, not an accident. The distribution of weight inside these gowns was unforgiving. Steel ribs dug into the maid's sides, textiles folded heavily onto her shoulders, and the strain of maintaining the gown's shape pressed firmly against her back. Over long evenings, the pressure accumulated until her muscles screamed for relief. But relief was not permitted. She could not stretch her legs, straighten her spine, or shift more than a fraction of an inch. Her position had to remain undetectable, her presence unacknowledged, her suffering invisible. Even the smallest movement could ripple through the fabric and betray the arrangement to guests who expected beauty, not the truth behind it. Beauty in the ballroom depended on the erasure of the labor below. The mistress above the gown glided through the room, unaware or unwilling to be aware of the body, carrying the weight under her. Compliments drifted toward her like warm air, praise for her poise, admiration for her style, approval of her taste. These words rose upward while the strain fell downward into the cramped darkness, where the maid held her breath and steadied the gown. The disconnect between admiration and reality became a quiet spectacle hidden in the folds of a dress that demanded more than elegance from those who served it. The arrangement reflected a broader truth about the era. Refinement was built upon the bodies of those who were never intended to be seen. Just as factories relied on unseen laborers and homes relied on silent servants, fashion relied on maids whose physical suffering allowed others to appear perfect. Victorian society celebrated restraint, modesty, and discipline, yet it demanded those virtues most intensely from the people least able to defend themselves. The maid beneath the gown absorbed the consequences of a beauty standard she could never share in shaping her body to uphold a world that did not acknowledge her existence. Some maids emerged from evenings so exhausted that they struggled to walk. Their legs trembled from hours spent crouched in confined positions, their backs stiff as though molded to the curves of the gowns they supported. Others sustained long-term injuries from the pressure placed on their joints and muscles, injuries that left their bodies permanently altered. Yet their pain remained undocumented. No journals or fashion columns recorded the cost of perfection. The suffering remained buried beneath layers of tulle and etiquette, hidden from the eyes of those who benefited from it. The painful irony was that the beauty admired by guests depended most heavily on the person least allowed to stand in the light. Her body became a scaffold for someone else's image, a structure the world was meant to forget, even as it relied upon her strength. The perfection, celebrated in the ballroom, was an illusion crafted by hands that trembled in darkness, created by a presence that society insisted on erasing. The evening's glow belonged to the mistress. The aches and bruises belonged to the maid. The elegance admired above rested entirely on bodies that absorbed the strain beneath it. Behind each flawless silhouette lay endurance no one intended to acknowledge. Beneath the layers of silk and steel, a heavier truth waited for anyone willing to confront the cost of beauty. The women who served beneath Victorian gowns rarely appeared in any written record, and their absence from official documents reflected more than simple oversight. They occupied a space so far removed from recognition that their work existed almost entirely outside the structure of formal employment. These maids came into the household quietly, often as young apprentices sent from rural villages where opportunities were scarce and families struggled to survive. Their presence filled the lowest tier of domestic hierarchy, visible enough to perform labor, invisible enough to be denied acknowledgement when it came to responsibility payment or protection. Most of them entered service before they were fully grown, their hands still small, their bodies still adjusting to the demands of labor. They learned to obey before they learned to speak confidently, taught by other servants that silence was safer than questions. Their tasks were described as training, though no formal instruction existed to guarantee improvement in their position. Instead, they were given the jobs no one else wanted: the cramped work beneath gowns, the unseen adjustments, the hours spent forced into stillness for the benefit of the women above them. Their status as learning girls allowed households to deny them wages or provide only tokens coins so small they barely paid for the fabric they wore. Official rosters of servants rarely included their names. When inspectors visited, or when the household accounted for wages, they listed cooks, butlers, chambermaids, governesses, but not the young girls folded beneath crinolines. Their absence served a purpose. It allowed their labor to be used without accountability and prevented questions about why children or adolescents endured such physically demanding roles. Without names, they left no trace in hiring records. Without wages, they had no contracts to defend their rights. Their existence hovered in the margins, acknowledged only when needed, and erased again as soon as the work ended. Their families accepted this arrangement, because it represented survival. A wealthy household, even one that refused to list its invisible laborers, offered food, shelter, and the possibility, however faint, of advancement. Parents sent their daughters into service, hoping they might earn enough to send money home or eventually become full servants with documented positions. But many remained trapped in apprentice status indefinitely. Their work was essential, yet their recognition was non-existent. The household depended on them, but the structure ensured they could be dismissed or replaced without explanation. Inside the home, their days unfolded in silence. They learned routines through observation, memorizing gestures and patterns that dictated where they should stand, when they should move, and how they should vanish from sight. Older servants might guide them, but guidance came in the form of warnings, to avoid being noticed, to obey without hesitation, to accept the conditions offered. The younger maids absorbed these expectations, molding themselves to fit the narrow boundaries placed around them. When assigned to the role beneath a gown, their age and size worked against them. Their small bodies made them ideal for crouching under the fabric, slipping into the hollow space between the steel hoops, and enduring the contorted posture required to maintain the structure. Their flexibility became a curse, allowing the household to demand more of them precisely because they were young. They spent long nights twisted into positions that strained their growing bones, yet they were told it was a privilege to be trusted with such an important part of their mistress's appearance. The lack of official status meant they had no protection when things went wrong. If the gown shifted awkwardly, or a guest noticed a tremor in the fabric, the blame fell immediately upon the hidden maid. If she fainted beneath the weight of silk and sweat, her collapse was treated as an inconvenience rather than an emergency. A mistress might blame her for ruining an evening's presentation. A housekeeper might accuse her of negligence. Without a name on the record, she could be dismissed, with no explanation, no reference letter, and no recourse. Her labor, unrecognized in writing, could be erased as though it had never existed. Even within the servant community, their position was precarious. Other servants pitied them, but understood the danger of aligning themselves too closely with girls who had no official place in the household. Friendships formed quietly, whispered in corners, or exchanged during brief moments away from supervision. These bonds offered comfort, but they could not change the reality. The invisible apprentices remained the most vulnerable workers in the house, bearing responsibilities without rights. Some girls endured these conditions, hoping for a future where they might be promoted into roles with names and wages. A few achieved it after years of dedication and silent endurance. Many others did not. Their identities faded into the long, unrecorded history of servants, whose contributions supported wealth and beauty without ever being acknowledged. The gowns they supported were preserved in portraits and descriptions, admired for their elegance. The women who wore them were remembered in diaries, letters, and social commentary. But the girls who sacrificed their comfort, their health, and sometimes their futures remained absent from the written world that surrounded them. Their existence was essential, yet they remained unnamed. The illusion of refinement rested on labor, carried out by those no one thought to record. Behind each flawless presentation lay workers whose lives the household allowed to disappear. In that quiet omission, a deeper layer of this world waited to reveal how far invisibility could reach. Movement within a Victorian ballroom often appeared effortless from the outside. Women glided across polished floors, their gowns sweeping behind them in wide, graceful arcs. The steel frames beneath these dresses swayed with each step, creating the illusion of floating fabric untouched by gravity. Yet inside the hollow spaces of those moving structures, the experience was far from serene. For the maids hidden beneath the layers, every shift in pace, every sudden turn, and every hurried step sent a jolt through the cramped darkness where they held their positions. What appeared graceful above translated into unpredictable force below. When a mistress moved quickly, the wide steel hoops of the crinoline struck against the maid's body with harsh precision. The framework was designed to maintain shape, not absorb impact, and its rigid ribs vibrated with each abrupt motion. The maid felt these vibrations along her shoulders, arms, and back, each one pressing deeper as she tried to steady herself without revealing her presence. The floor beneath her often shifted as the mistress navigated the ballroom, causing the maid to brace her body against the inner lining. Even the smallest imbalance became a physical blow when amplified through steel and fabric. These impacts rarely caused immediate collapse. Instead, they built upon one another slowly, quietly over the course of the evening. A sharp jolt against the ribs might leave a lingering ache. A sudden sway might twist a knee or strain a wrist. A misaligned step from above could drive the steel frame into the maid's shoulder with bruising force. The injuries were rarely dramatic, but they endured deepening, with repetition night after night. The maid learned to anticipate certain movements, bracing for them, without seeing them, relying solely on the subtle cues in her mistress's posture. The greatest danger came when the mistress turned too sharply or stepped backward without warning. These movements caused the crinoline to whip unexpectedly, striking the maid's body at angles difficult to absorb. She had no space to retreat, no room to shift her weight safely. The confined darkness forced her to remain within the path of every impact. Over hours, her muscles tightened from resisting motion. Her joints stiffened from holding unnatural positions, and her skin grew tender from repeated contact with steel ribs. Each blow forced her deeper into silence, reinforcing the expectation that she should endure unseen and unmentioned. No one above considered the physical toll of these movements. The ballroom existed for display, not contemplation. Guests focused on music, conversation, and the slow coordination of dancers as they formed elegant shapes across the floor. The mistress herself rarely felt more than the slight tug of fabric or the resistance of the gown's weight. She remained unaware of how her choices, her pace, her posture, her direction translated into punishment for the person beneath her. The world above continued as though no one existed beneath the gown at all. When the evening ended, the maid finally slipped out from her hidden position, her legs trembling from hours of strain. Often she limped quietly back to the servants' quarters, careful not to draw attention. Her arms and back bore marks from the steel frame. Her knees ached from pressure and repeated collisions. Yet there was no examination, no inquiry, no moment of care. The household expected her to return to work the next day, ready for the next event, prepared to enter the same confined darkness again. Injuries, unless severe enough to prevent movement entirely, were dismissed as part of her role. Even the injuries that lingered, bruises that darkened across her skin, joints that swelled or stiffened, ribs that throbbed with each breath, went untreated. Doctors were reserved for the family. Servants were expected to manage their own discomfort. A maid who complained too often risked replacement. A maid who moved too slowly risked punishment. So she learned to hide her pain, just as she hid her presence beneath the gown. She wrapped cloth tightly around sore joints, applied cold water when possible, and endured the rest in silence. The repetition of these impacts shaped the bodies of the maids over time. Some developed chronic pain that followed them long after they left service. Others experienced impaired mobility or lingering weakness. The invisible violence of the crinoline left no dramatic scenes, no witnesses, no recorded accounts, yet it carved itself into the bones and muscles of those who supported the structure from within. This quiet suffering existed alongside the grandeur it enabled. The gowns became symbols of elegance, discussed in magazines, admired in portraits, preserved in memory as emblems of refinement. Meanwhile, the maids who bore the blows remained unacknowledged. Their injuries did not fit the narrative of beauty that society preferred. The world above celebrated movement. The world below endured its consequences. Nothing about these collisions was accidental. They were the direct result of a system designed to value appearance over humanity. The steel framework that shaped the gowns became a weapon each time a mistress turned too quickly. The maid beneath bore every impact, the hidden price of maintaining an illusion everyone demanded but no one questioned. Beneath the soft glow of ballroom lights, their suffering remained buried under silk and silence. The graceful motions admired in the ballroom depended on bodies absorbing blows no one else felt. Behind each fluid turn lingered the strain of someone forced to endure it without recognition. Beyond that quiet impact lay another truth waiting for anyone willing to see what the fabric concealed. The confined darkness beneath a Victorian gown created conditions that few would willingly endure. Heavy fabrics trapped heat, the steel framework limited airflow, and the maid, hidden within the layers, found herself enclosed in a pocket of rising warmth and stale air. In such a space, the body reacted naturally. Sweat formed, breath deepened, muscles strained. But none of these reactions were permitted to betray her presence. She was expected to erase every sign of her own humanity, to protect the illusion above her. The slightest odor or sound could expose the arrangement, and exposure meant immediate dismissal. To prevent this, maids developed quiet methods of masking their bodies long before stepping into the hollow beneath a gown. Earth and clay played an unexpected role. Applied to the skin in thin layers, they acted as a kind of primitive absorbent, soaking in sweat before it could warm the air around her. The clay dried into a muted coating that dulled the natural scent and reduced the moisture that would otherwise accumulate under the dress. On cool evenings, it chilled her skin, On warm ones it hardened uncomfortably, yet it provided enough control to meet the household's expectations. No one above needed to smell the person holding the structure together. Along with clay, certain herbs were used to dull or disguise scent. Crushed lavender, rosemary, and mint were tied into small cloth bundles and tucked discreetly into the maid's undergarments or sleeves. These herbs released faint aromas that mingled with the weight of the gown, creating a subtle buffer between her body and the enclosed air. The scent was never strong enough to draw attention, only enough to prevent unwanted questions. Some maids chewed leaves quietly before entering the gown, hoping the faint sharpness on their breath would keep them alert through the long hours of stillness. Others used sprigs of dried plants as anchors for calm, focusing on their scent to steady themselves in the suffocating dark. Yet more demanding than scent control was the discipline of breath. The air beneath the gown grew thick quickly, and breathing deeply risked shifting the fabric or causing a faint sound. The maid was required to adopt a pattern of slow, shallow breaths, rationing air as though each inhalation cost her something. She learned to time her breathing to the rhythm of the ballroom above, drawing breath when music swelled, or when guests laughed, exhaling during louder moments. Over time, her lungs adapted to the restricted movement, though strain often followed her long after the event ended. Some described feeling as though their chest was wrapped in fabric long after the gown had been removed. Silence became a craft. The maid learned how to swallow soundlessly, how to shift her tongue, how to tense her throat so that no involuntary noises escaped. Even her heartbeat seemed too loud in the stillness beneath the gown. Her body, ordinarily full of natural responses to discomfort, had to be trained to behave as if it were not alive. Such training did not come easily. Younger maids struggled with involuntary grunts of strain or soft gasps when the heat became overwhelming. These mistakes were corrected sternly by housekeepers, who reminded them that any noise could jeopardize the household's reputation. For some households, the training went further. Selected maids, often the smallest and physically most disciplined, received quiet instruction in the techniques used by performers who specialized in silent movement. Servants observed the controlled breathing of stage actors or the stillness practiced by dancers preparing backstage. They adjusted these practices for the harsher circumstances beneath a gown. Maids learned to tense muscles in ways that prevented trembling to map their weight distribution so precisely that even a shift of a single finger could alter the balance of the structure above. They were taught how to suspend motion entirely when required, entering a state of near-complete physical restraint. These teachings were never formalized in manuals, yet they passed through generations of servants by whispered instruction. A senior maid showed the younger ones how to reduce sound by tightening specific muscles. She explained how to suppress the instinct to stretch or adjust posture, how to avoid letting exhaustion create small, involuntary movements. The training shaped the maid's body into something more like a mechanism than a living person, quiet, controlled, stripped of spontaneity. Despite these efforts, discomfort remained constant. The clay hardened on the skin, becoming itchy as the night progressed. The herbs eventually lost their fragrance, overwhelmed by the heat beneath the dress. Breath grew tight, the lungs protesting their confinement. Still, the maid held her silence. She understood that failure meant dismissal, and dismissal meant returning to a life where hunger and uncertainty overshadowed everything else. The household never asked how she managed to remain quiet. They asked only that she succeed. The demands placed on the maid revealed the stark divide between appearance and reality. Above the gown, the ballroom glowed with candlelight and genteel conversation. Below it, a body fought to remain invisible. Every breath controlled, every scent masked, every sound swallowed. These became part of the unseen labor that sustained the world above. Silence was not simply expected. It was enforced through necessity, fear, and the unspoken understanding that invisibility was the only acceptable form a servant could take. The poised elegance admired from across the room depended on bodies trained to erase themselves. Behind each quiet moment lay discipline that pressed the living into near stillness. Just beyond that silence, another truth waited to disturb the world that never questioned what kept its beauty intact. Fainting beneath a Victorian gown was not a dramatic collapse witnessed by a crowd. It was a quiet disappearance that unfolded in suffocating darkness. The maids, hidden inside the hollow space of the crinoline, were already working at the limits of breath and endurance. Their bodies confined in positions that strained, the ribs tightened the lungs, and restricted movement so severely that collapse became an ever-present possibility. The heat beneath the layers, the pressure of the steel hoops, and the constant need for silence created conditions that pushed the body toward exhaustion faster than anyone above could imagine. And when consciousness slipped away, it often did so without warning. A fainting maid had no space to fall. Her body simply folded inward, collapsing against the steel frame or the lining of the dress. Sometimes the mistress felt the slightest shift, a soft sag in the shape of her gown, but even this subtle sign rarely prompted concern. Women often assumed it was their own fatigue or the natural movement of the fabric. The ballroom remained a place of music and conversation, where no one suspected that another person's suffering was unfolding, inches from polished shoes and swirling hems. Beneath the candlelit glow, the maid's collapse remained hidden, swallowed by silk and social expectation. Guests continued dancing, unaware that a life was dimming just beyond their sight. The lively rhythm of violins, the rise and fall of laughter, and the rustle of skirts blended into a veneer of normalcy. Within this world of sound and movement, the maid's silence remained perfect too, perfect for anyone to realize something was wrong. Even as her breathing slowed or stopped, the structure of the gown concealed her body with the same elegance it displayed when she was conscious. The crinoline did not betray its secret. The maid remained buried in the role assigned to her collapse invisible by design. Some fainting spells were temporary. A maid regained consciousness after several minutes, disoriented but still silent, clutching at the steel frame to steady herself. Her recovery happened in the same darkness that swallowed her collapse. No one saw the panic in her eyes or the tremor in her hands. No one knew how close she had come to losing consciousness permanently. She composed herself, adjusted her posture, and resumed her role without hesitation. The event passed unnoticed, becoming another unrecorded moment in a life where suffering was expected to remain private. But not every maid awoke quickly. Some remained unconscious for the rest of the evening. Their bodies slumped into uncomfortable angles beneath the fabric. To the world above, nothing seemed amiss. The mistress moved carefully, or remained seated, unaware of the danger she carried within her gown. No guest observed the subtle irregularities that might have betrayed the truth. The household staff circulating the ballroom paid attention to fallen gloves, empty glasses, and fading candles, not the unseen stillness beneath a dress. Only after the final guests departed, when the music silenced and the glow of the candles dimmed, did the truth emerge. The mistress stepped away from the center of the room, prepared to retire, and only then sensed the gown's strange heaviness. A whispered instruction called a servant, who lifted the layers of fabric to reveal the collapsed form within. By that hour, the maid's body was often cold, her breath absent, her face drained of color. She had died in total silence, surrounded by music and laughter, unnoticed until the night no longer needed her presence. Households responded to these deaths with the same quietness that had defined the maid's life. There were no public inquiries, no discussions among the guests, no mention in the social papers. The death of an unrecorded servant carried no weight in a society structured to ignore those who sustained it. The mistress might feel a momentary shock, perhaps even guilt, but the world around her would ease those emotions with comforting phrases about faint hearts or weak constitutions. In truth, the conditions themselves were lethal. Yet acknowledging this would require admitting that beauty rested on brutality, that elegance demanded more than discomfort. It demanded lives. Even other servants rarely heard the full story. Word travelled in whispers, carrying fragments of fear. The gown that grew too still, the girl who did not wake the housekeeper, who quietly arranged to have her body moved before dawn. These stories spread among maids like warnings, reminders of the danger woven into their work. They understood that the ballroom could consume them without anyone noticing, not out of malice, but because the system they served was built to make them invisible even in death. What lingered most painfully was the knowledge that the maid's final moments were spent suffocating in darkness while celebration thrived above her. The contrast revealed the deepest contradiction of Victorian refinement. Beauty flourished in rooms filled with light, while the labour that enabled it remained buried in shadows where suffering left no mark. The music moved on. The guests forgot. The gown was cleaned and worn again, but the world beneath it had absorbed another life. The glow of the ballroom continued, even as bodies collapsed unseen beneath the weight of elegance. Behind each night of celebration lay dangers. The room above never paused to consider. Far below the music and light, a darker truth persisted, waiting for the right silence to reveal itself. Silence surrounding the presence of hidden servants functioned less as a rule and more as an unspoken boundary, that shaped the way Victorian high society protected its image. The upper class depended on a polished vision of elegance, and anything that hinted at physical struggle, bodily discomfort, or the involvement of lower-class labour beneath the surface was quietly removed from public awareness. This silence required discipline from everyone involved. Mistresses never referred to the unseen hands that maintained the perfection of their appearance, and guests were discouraged from asking questions that might disturb the illusion. The expectation was simple: refinement must seem effortless, and effort must never be acknowledged. Within these circles, the role of a maid concealed beneath a gown became one of the most carefully guarded secrets. It was treated not as a practical necessity, but as a private matter of decorum, something never discussed in open conversation. Social gatherings relied on this unwritten rule, and the people who upheld it understood how fragile the illusion could be. A single, careless remark about the hidden assistants might fracture the image of self-contained beauty that defined the elite. To maintain this facade, silence became a form of currency, one that reinforced hierarchy and demanded obedience. New guests entering the social sphere were often unaware of these customs. They arrived captivated by the grandeur of the ballroom, unaware of the mechanisms that sustained it. When they noticed unusual stiffness in a gown, or glimpsed a faint movement beneath the fabric, they interpreted it as a trick of the light or a quirk of design. No one corrected their assumptions. The silence of the room guided their understanding, teaching them through omission rather than instruction. Observing the behavior of others showed them what could be mentioned and what must remain unspoken. Over time, they learned that curiosity was discouraged, and attention to the invisible labor beneath the glamour was gently redirected to more acceptable topics. The servants themselves understood the weight of this secrecy. Their work existed in a space that denied recognition by design. Even their presence was filtered through the demands of decorum, requiring them to disappear the moment they became inconvenient. A maid who failed to maintain silence or revealed her role inadvertently risked immediate dismissal. The household expected perfection from her, not only in action but in her absence. This expectation shaped the way she moved, breathed, and endured discomfort. Her survival in the household depended on a loyalty to the illusion she helped create. Social hierarchies relied on this hidden structure to maintain stability. By ensuring that guests never considered the labor needed to uphold refinement, the upper class reinforced the myth that their lifestyle rested on innate grace rather than the constant effort of those beneath them. These myths supported the idea that beauty, wealth, and composure were natural qualities of the elite. The existence of a maid hidden beneath a gown contradicted this narrative. Therefore, it had to remain invisible, not only physically, but also socially. Even when an experienced guest suspected the presence of a hidden maid, courtesy demanded that they pretend not to know. A discreet glance away served as acknowledgement of the rule. To maintain appearances, they acted as though gowns floated effortlessly, as though no human body strained beneath the fabric. This denial allowed them to enjoy the spectacle without confronting the uncomfortable truth at its core. Every ballroom relied on this shared agreement, a collective refusal to acknowledge what lay beneath the surface. Mothers instructed their daughters in these rules without saying them outright. A young girl, learning to navigate society, saw how her mother never asked questions about the flawless appearance of others. She noticed how servants received no praise for the perfection they maintained. She understood that refinement depended not on transparency, but on careful concealment. In this way, silence passed from one generation to the next, shaping the behavior of women who would eventually command gowns of their own. Households enforced these unspoken rules with precision. Written policies never mentioned concealed servants, yet every housekeeper knew the expectations around discretion. Instructions were given in low voices, framed as reminders rather than orders. The maids knew not to speak of their roles outside the household. Even among themselves, they used vague descriptions instead of detailed accounts. Their work existed on the edge of visibility, and the boundaries surrounding it were constantly reinforced by the stern quietness of the world above. The impact of these rules extended beyond individual households. They influenced how the upper class viewed labor hierarchy and responsibility. By refusing to acknowledge the human cost of perfection, society distanced itself from the realities endured by those who served it. This distance allowed the wealthy to maintain a polished identity, free from the burdens of empathy or self-reflection. The silence became a shield, protecting not only their image, but their conscience. The weight of these unspoken rules could be felt in every ballroom. Beneath the warmth of candlelight, beneath the swirling gowns and polished manners, the presence of hidden labour lingered quietly. Every guest stepped carefully around what they were not allowed to see. Every movement carried the subtle tension of concealment. The ballroom became a stage where elegance was performed without revealing the backstage work that sustained it. The unspoken rules held every secret in place, leaving no room for questions or names. Behind polished etiquette, silence carried more power than any spoken command. Something in that quiet space hinted at bonds far more complicated than the world above ever acknowledged. They moved through the same rooms every day, yet only one of them was meant to be seen. The relationship between a Victorian lady and the maid, assigned to her body, was built on closeness so intense that it became almost unsettling, and at the same time, on a distance so rigid that it never softened in public. From the outside, their lives looked separate and unequal, but anyone who watched them quietly for long enough would understand how deeply their worlds pressed against one another, held together by duty, silence, and the demands of appearances. The maid knew the lady's schedule, her weaknesses, her discomforts, and the small troubles she never voiced aloud. She prepared the clothing, tightened the laces, adjusted the layers, and shaped the silhouette until it looked exactly as required. Nothing worn in a ballroom was simple, and nothing was left to chance. The maid absorbed every detail because she had to, because the lady depended on her to appear flawless, and because the household quietly expected it. The lady allowed the maid into a kind of personal territory that no one else entered. She stood half-dressed under the warm glow of a lamp, while the maid arranged each layer, pulling, fastening, lifting the ribbons and fabric. The maid felt the trembling when the corset cinched too tightly, sensed the shallow breaths of strain, and recognized the signs of faintness long before the lady herself admitted them. In that enclosed space, the maid learned how to anticipate without speaking. She held salt or a cloth ready when the lady paled, loosened a tie when the room felt too warm, and straightened each piece before anyone else saw her work. The connection was intimate but never equal. It was shaped entirely by a hierarchy that the two women never discussed, but always obeyed. Outside that private room, the relationship changed instantly. The lady walked gracefully into the hallway, while the maid stepped aside, silent and unnoticed. No one asked for the maid's name. Guests never looked her way. In formal gatherings, she was expected to move like furniture present, but invisible, functioning only to support the woman who stood at the center of attention. If someone asked who helped with the preparations, the lady would simply say, "My maid," as though the girl behind the title did not exist as a person, only as a role. The maid had to accept this division every day, even after she had held the lady's hand through dizziness, or steadied her. When the corset made her knees weak, the emotional distance demanded by society was strict. A lady could speak gently to her maid, could treat her with small kindnesses, but she could not acknowledge affection openly. She could not call the girl by name during a gathering, nor introduce her to others, nor allow any sign that their connection extended beyond work. Respect was permitted, recognition was not. The maid learned this early, often from other servants who whispered warnings to avoid mistakes that might cost them their place in the household. If the maid ever forgot the boundaries, the consequences would appear, quickly reassignment, punishment, or dismissal. For girls who came from rural poverty and had few options, stepping out of line was never an option. Survival meant obeying the distance, no matter how many hours they spent inches away from the lady's skin. Yet the closeness was real. The maid knew the exact moments when the lady felt self-conscious. She knew which fabrics irritated her, which colors she preferred, and how much tightening she could endure before the pain grew severe. She recognized the tremors of fatigue during long events, and the subtle posture shifts when discomfort became unbearable. The lady, though restrained by decorum, relied on this awareness. In return, she sometimes offered short, quiet remarks behind closed doors. Gratitude whispered, while the maid adjusted a fastener or a softened tone when the day had been difficult. These moments did not change their positions in the hierarchy, but they created a strange, unspoken bond that could not exist anywhere except in that small room where only the two of them stood. During dances and formal dinners, the maid hovered at the edge of attention, ready for small signals. A raised hand, a glance, or a slight tilt of the head told her when to step forward. She managed the dress, kept its shape, and corrected mishaps before they reached the eyes of the guests. Her movements were silent and efficient. If she did her job perfectly, no one would notice she was there at all. That invisibility was considered proof of her skill. But the effort behind it was endless. Many maids returned to their quarters, exhausted knees, bruised fingers stiff from hours of pinning and adjusting. They carried the strain alone without complaint, because complaint was not permitted. The intertwining of their lives created an unusual duality. The maid was essential but never acknowledged, deeply connected, yet always erased. The lady's appearance depended on the maid's constant presence, but society insisted on pretending that dependence did not exist. This left the maid in a perpetual shadow, close enough to feel the heat of the ballroom lights through the layers of fabric, yet always standing outside the world they illuminated. For anyone watching quietly, the truth was clear. Behind every graceful movement on the dance floor, a maid had prepared the body that performed it. Behind every perfect dress, a maid had worked through pain and silence to uphold the illusion of ease. Behind every poised smile, there was someone who had steadied trembling hands just moments earlier. The relationship between the two women was built on proximity and secrecy, a connection that shaped the appearance of the upper class, while hiding the body that made it possible. The quiet bond between them existed only in rooms without witnesses. Behind each polished gesture lay hours of labor neither of them could ever speak about. Hints of a deeper strain lingered in the silence they shared, suggesting more beneath the surface than anyone ever admitted. Some households presented their young maids with choices that were never truly choices, setting up conditions in which staying employed required accepting a role no one spoke of aloud. The pressure settled quietly on them from the moment they arrived, long before they even understood what tasks would be expected. A girl from the countryside came to work, believing she would sweep floors, heat water, mend clothing, and learn her place slowly through careful routines. Instead, she discovered that certain households tied a maid's future to tasks that had nothing to do with ordinary service. The threat of dismissal hung over her like a constant weight, shaping every decision she made before she even learned the full cost of remaining in the home. Most of these young maids entered service for the sake of their families, not for themselves. Their wages, meagre as they were, could mean a small rise in food on the table or the ability to pay a debt that kept their parents awake at night. These realities made refusal nearly impossible. When the mistress hinted that the girl would be needed during the evening festivities, the maid understood that this was not an invitation. It was a warning phrased with the politeness of the upper classes, but carrying the firmness of an order that could not be questioned. She was to slip beneath the dress, hide herself inside the steel frame, and remain there until summoned or until the night ended. Each time a new girl resisted the household, found ways to make her compliance seem like the only reasonable path. They told her that other maids had done it before, that the task was not difficult, that it would only be for a short while, or that refusing would be a sign of ungratefulness. Words were softened, voices were calm, yet the meaning remained the same. Her place depended on her silence and obedience. Many girls accepted because they felt cornered long before anyone openly stated the consequences. A few departed quickly, slipping out into the night with nothing but their clothing and the hope of finding safer work elsewhere. Their absence was rarely mentioned beyond whispers in the servants' quarters. The majority, however, stayed. They stayed because they feared hunger. After all, they feared the shame of returning home empty-handed because they feared losing the only income their families depended on. Endurance became a kind of survival. They learned to crawl into the steel frame without hesitation, to fold themselves into narrow spaces, to keep their breathing shallow, so their presence would not disturb the outward appearance of grace. They adapted to conditions that should never have been demanded of anyone, and yet they spoke of it only among themselves when they were far from the ears of their employers. Some maids described their first time beneath a dress as a moment of shock. The closeness of the fabric, the weight of the layers, the darkness that pressed against them, all combined to create a confinement that felt unreal. They wondered if their bodies would last until the end of the night, yet they did last because the alternative was believing they had failed their families. The emotional burden of such responsibility added to the physical discomfort. No one outside the servant circle ever understood how heavy that combination could be. There were nights when the mistress moved too quickly or turned too sharply, sending the steel frame swaying in ways the maid could not anticipate. Bruises appeared on her arms, her ribs, her legs, but she learned to hide them beneath long sleeves and quiet expressions. No one asked, and she did not explain. In the hierarchy of the household, the suffering of a maid was not something to be acknowledged. It was expected to be borne without complaint, absorbed into the daily rhythm of service, then forgotten by everyone, except the one who lived through it. Over time, some maids became accustomed to the lack of choice. They accepted the role because the consequences of refusing seemed worse. They learned to calculate how long a night would last, how to pace their breathing, how to shift their weight to avoid numbness that crept slowly through their limbs. They became, in the eyes of the household, dependable. That dependability came at a private cost, and it was rarely recognized, much less rewarded. Even after their bodies ached or their spirits dimmed, they reminded themselves that leaving was not an option. The fear of being dismissed overshadowed everything. To be turned out meant losing food, shelter, wages, and the dignity of steady employment. For many, that fear outweighed any discomfort beneath the dress. They held on night after night, simply to keep a place in a world that offered them so few alternatives. The upper classes relied on this fear, shaping a system where endurance was mistaken for loyalty and silence was mistaken for obedience. By the time a maid became fully aware of her lack of freedom, she had already crossed the point where departure felt impossible. Her work and her suffering had merged into one continuous pattern, shaping her days and nights without interruption. She served because she believed she must. After all, she believed there was nowhere else to go, because she believed survival came only through compliance. That belief kept the system intact and kept her body hidden beneath the dress whenever the household demanded it. The choice presented to these young women had never been a true decision, only an expectation disguised as one. Behind each polished evening lay a chain of silent compromises carried by those no one noticed. Beneath that quiet endurance lingered a truth about who bore the real cost of the beauty on display. There were countless written accounts from the upper classes that described Victorian evenings in careful detail, dwelling on the elegance of silk, the sheen of polished floors, and the order of rituals that shaped each gathering. These writings captured dances, conversations, and the shimmering movement of dresses under candlelight. But they never spoke of the presence hidden inside the garments themselves. The omission was deliberate, woven into the culture of the era as naturally as the corsets the women wore. The more one examines these accounts, the clearer it becomes that the silence surrounding the maids was not accidental. It was built into the very structure of social life, ensuring that the upper classes appeared effortless, while those who made that effort possible were erased. Books on etiquette and society often went into great depth about how a dress should fall, how it should be lifted when walking, and how the fabric should curve to create the perfect silhouette. These instructions sounded precise and technical, yet they never acknowledged the human being who sometimes had to crouch beneath the frame to ensure that the dress held its shape. Each page assumed that beauty was self-sustaining, that materials behaved obediently, that fabric moved as intended, simply because it was fashioned by skilled hands. No mention existed of the one who maintained that illusion from below, remaining still for hours so that the grace above could appear natural. Historical illustrations captured the idealized appearance of noble women, showing them radiant under chandeliers' light, reflecting off layers of satin. Artists emphasized symmetry, posture, and refinement. The images suggested a world held together by elegance, but they ignored the labor that made the elegance possible. Not a single line or shadow hinted that someone might be hidden just inches from the floor, confined by steel hoops and heavy cloth shaping the outline of the dress in complete darkness. The painters and writers of that age built a world where only the surface mattered, and the surface told only half the truth. Even within households, the existence of these hidden maids was treated as a private arrangement, never to be noted in family records or formal lists of staff. Ledgers tracked expenses for embroidery, jewelry, perfumes, and servants' wages, yet they never acknowledged the work done by girls who crawled beneath crinolines. These young women existed in a space between recorded labor and unspoken necessity. Their tasks were essential, but undocumented, as though their bodies were simply extensions of the dress itself. To write them down would have revealed a dependence that the upper classes preferred not to admit. The families who employed these maids often took pride in their public image, ensuring that every detail of their home conveyed wealth and discipline. They hosted gatherings designed to showcase their refinement. Guests admired the precision with which the ladies carried themselves, the smoothness of their gestures, the perfect balance of their gowns. That admiration depended on a meticulously crafted illusion. Behind the illusion were hands that never appeared in photographs, faces that never looked into the light, and bodies pressed against the metal ribs of a dress frame until numbness settled into their limbs. Some maids spent years performing this task. Their presence was not occasional, but continuous, demanded whenever the dress was worn for formal events. They learned to prepare for long evenings by steadying their breathing and bracing their muscles for stillness. They understood how to shift their weight without causing movement that could be noticed from outside. Their familiarity with the dress grew until they could anticipate the mistress's steps from the first shift of fabric above. With time, their identity became absorbed into the role, making it all the more likely that history would overlook them. To observers, the dress seemed flawless. To the maid beneath it, the night stretched endlessly. When these women aged or became ill, they were replaced quietly, often without ceremony or acknowledgement. They slipped out of the household, just as they had slipped under the dress, unseen. New girls took their place, arriving from distant villages, with the hope of earning wages that would support their families. They too learned quickly that part of the job could involve disappearing into a garment. Each generation repeated the same quiet endurance, becoming part of a cycle that linked the unseen labor of many to the visible beauty of a few. Looking back, the absence of these maids from the historical record reveals more than the practices themselves. It shows how thoroughly society controlled the narrative of elegance, allowing only stories that supported its ideals to survive. The truth of who enabled the appearance of refinement was not preserved because it was never meant to be known. Their suffering remained private, their contributions unacknowledged, and their presence erased. Their bodies supported the display of wealth, yet they were treated as though they belonged beneath the surface of history, just as they had belonged beneath the fabric of the dresses they held in place. Their work shaped the image of an era that celebrated order and grace, while the lives that made that grace possible were left undocumented. Their story survived only through fragments spoken in corners or remembered by those who lived through it. Their endurance formed the hidden base of gatherings that celebrated elegance without restraint. The weight they carried reveals how beauty was maintained through quiet bodies no one saw. There is still more to uncover about the lives shaped by this silent service. By the late 19th century, small signs of resistance began to surface, though they appeared slowly and without the force one might expect from a society weighed down by hidden labor. The first murmurs came from journalists who dared to document what they called the inhumane underside of evening gatherings. Their articles did not appear in the most prestigious papers, but found space in modest publications read by shopkeepers, clerks, and the working poor. These short reports described long hours endured beneath heavy fabrics, the injuries caused by steel hoops, and the strange expectation that women in service should disappear into garments, as though their bodies held no value. The tone was restrained, yet the fact that anyone wrote about it at all was unusual in a world so invested in maintaining its polished surface. Novelists too began to adopt these hidden figures as symbols of suppressed lives. Their stories rarely addressed the practice directly, but they built characters who existed in shadows, serving families without acknowledgement. These works portrayed the emotional strain of women who lived between visibility and erasure, shaping scenes in which the glow of chandeliers contrasted sharply with the unseen suffering beneath. Readers were often unsure whether the stories were exaggerations or metaphorical criticisms of broader social conditions. Still, the presence of such imagery in literature marked a subtle shift. Fiction had created space for the idea that beauty demanded sacrifice from those denied any share in it. Fashion reformers working in small circles of intellectuals and physicians also began to question the structure of women's clothing. Their concerns initially focused on corsets, which caused respiratory problems, displaced organs, and contributed to fainting spells. Yet, as discussions expanded, some reformers addressed the impracticality and danger of crinolines themselves. They argued that dresses should allow freedom of movement, reduce fire hazards, and eliminate the need for hidden assistance. These proposals were met with quiet resistance from the wealthy, who saw no reason to abandon garments that signaled their status. Still, the arguments spread, finding supporters among teachers, nurses, and middle-class women who wanted more functional attire. As these voices grew, the edges of social acceptance began to shift. Ladies' magazines published cautious critiques of overly stiff silhouettes, noting that excessive layering made movement difficult and created unnecessary dependence on servants. Illustrations showed alternative shapes, less rigid, more natural, suggesting a future where elegance did not require elaborate internal frameworks. Most readers viewed these suggestions as passing trends, unaware of how deeply they were connected to the lives of those who worked beneath the fabric. Change came slowly, but the pressure to reconsider fashion norms had begun to accumulate. Behind the scenes, tailors and dressmakers quietly explored new methods of construction. They experimented with lighter materials and reduced the size of metal hoops. Some adopted layered petticoats that provided volume without creating the cavernous spaces where a maid could be concealed. These changes were motivated partly by the shifting tastes of clients and partly by a growing awareness of how burdensome traditional designs had become. While few openly acknowledged the real impact on the hidden maids, the modifications nonetheless reduced the need for such extreme forms of assistance. The spread of information also played a role. As literacy increased, more people gained access to newspapers and novels, and rumors about hidden servants traveled beyond the walls of aristocratic homes. Stories of girls fainting under crinolines or being dismissed after making noise reached broader audiences. Some communities expressed quiet outrage, particularly among families whose daughters worked in domestic service. Conversations emerged about the boundaries of acceptable labor, though these discussions were often fragmented and lacked public support from those in power. Even so, the idea that the practice might be improper began to take hold. It did not lead to immediate bans or official rules, but it introduced tension into households that had once taken the arrangement for granted. Some mistresses hesitated before asking a maid to slip beneath a dress. Others avoided it entirely, fearing whispers that they were indulging in outdated or cruel customs. A few women, influenced by reform movements, publicly condemned the practice within their social circles. Though such criticism was phrased delicately to avoid scandal, their objections marked the first visible cracks in a tradition built on silence. By the final years of the century, the combination of public writing, fictional narratives, fashion reform, and quiet household decisions made the practice increasingly rare. It did not vanish because society suddenly chose compassion. It faded because the social aesthetic and practical conditions that supported it began to shift. Beauty was being redefined, and the new vision no longer required a body hidden beneath the dress. Yet, even as the practice declined, the women who once endured it received no recognition. Their suffering remained undocumented, their names unwritten, their stories absent from official accounts. What change occurred did so without ever acknowledging what had been endured. The silence that had defined their role continued into the historical record, leaving only scattered hints of lives spent beneath the surface of fashion. These early movements revealed how fragile the old expectations truly were. Each small challenge weakened the illusion that elegance required someone else's silence. Traces of deeper fractures waited beneath these shifts, marking paths toward truths society had long avoided. Their disappearance was not marked by ceremony, record, or remembrance. It happened quietly, almost naturally, as though the world had already decided that their lives belonged in the background. When a maid who once crouched beneath the heavy structure of a crinoline left her post, there was no notation in a ledger, no paragraph in a diary, no mention in the letters exchanged between households. She simply ceased to exist within the environment that had relied on her body, and those who replaced her stepped into the same silence. The absence was immediate, yet unnoticed, absorbed into the steady movement of social routines. No portraits captured their faces. Cameras had become common enough to document families' gatherings and celebrations, yet none were ever aimed at the women who slipped under dresses or steadied the fabric from within. Their existence was considered too trivial, too ordinary, or too uncomfortable to record. Even when photographic studios produced images of grand gowns displayed on mannequins, the structure of the dress was highlighted, while the hidden bodies that once supported such shapes were forgotten. Their labor was never meant to be part of the visual memory of the era. In household staff lists, their names were conspicuously missing. Cooks, coachmen, chambermaids, and governesses were documented because their duties were outward and visible. But those who served under crinolines were considered supplemental, unofficial, or temporary. They floated between roles, sometimes seamstress apprentices, sometimes general maids, but their most burdensome service was excluded from written acknowledgement. The absence was systematic, reinforced by social norms that valued discretion above truth. Their life stories, already fragile, dissolved further each time a record left them unnamed. Among the working class, whispers occasionally circulated about the girls sent to wealthier households, describing tasks so uncomfortable that they rarely spoke of them directly. These stories traveled in fragments. A mother might warn her daughter about the dangers of certain employers. A laundress might mention hearing of a girl who fainted during a long evening. A seamstress might whisper about a friend who returned home limping. Yet none of these whispers solidified into formal testimony. They remained part rumor, part half-remembered caution, drifting between communities like faint echoes of a truth no one dared to articulate fully. Over time, these women became part of a collective memory shaped not by documents but by suggestion. Some older servants spoke of them as though they were shadows that had once moved beneath layers of fabric. Others referred to them with a mixture of pity and resignation, acknowledging the hardship without naming those who endured it. The maids themselves rarely left written accounts. Many could not write. Others feared consequences if their words were discovered. For those who survived the experience, silence became an extension of service, something learned, practiced, and internalized. Meanwhile, fashion history continued to celebrate the aesthetic achievements of the Victorian era. Museums displayed crinolines, gowns, and accessories, presenting them as marvels of design and engineering. Visitors admired the symmetry of the hoops, the precision of the stitching, and the luxurious quality of the fabrics. Plaques explained the evolution of silhouettes and the influence of industrial manufacturing, yet none mentioned the women who once crouched inside the garments, holding their shape with their own bodies. In these curated narratives, the dresses were remembered as triumphs of elegance detached from the reality that had given them form. Scholars studying the period often focused on social structures, gender expectations, and the symbolism of fashion. But even their writings rarely addressed the hidden maids. The lack of records made reliable analysis difficult, and the absence of direct testimony discouraged deeper inquiry. Most investigations concluded that if evidence was scarce, the practice must have been rare. Yet scarcity of evidence was not proof of rarity, it was proof of erasure. Silence had erased the boundaries between truth and forgetting. In families whose ancestors wore such dresses, the memory of hidden helpers faded entirely. Descendants preserved stories of great-grandmothers who attended formal balls, recounting anecdotes of etiquette and splendor. They did not remember, or perhaps never knew, that the elegance was shaped by someone else's stillness and endurance. Time softened the sharp edges of the past, leaving behind only polished images that aligned neatly with the ideals of refinement. To consider the fate of these maids is to confront the uncomfortable truth that a life can disappear without leaving any trace beyond the strain it carried. Their suffering left no marks on official papers, no names engraved on plaques, no memoirs hidden in attics. It lingered only in the weight of the dresses that outlived them, preserved in collections admired for beauty, while their stories collapsed into silence. For every gown displayed behind glass, there was once a girl beneath it, who bent her spine to hold it steady. For every silhouette praised in books, there was someone who endured the heat, darkness, and confinement needed to maintain that perfection. These women existed just long enough for their labor to be used, then vanished without a record. History did not forget them. It never wrote them down. Their absence remains sharper than any documented account could ever be. Behind each preserved gown lies a life that slipped away without recognition. There are still unsettled truths buried beneath this silence, waiting in the shadows of what comes after. Looking back across the distance of more than a century, the Victorian world appears bright at first glance, its elegance preserved in paintings, surviving garments, and carefully curated museum displays. The gowns still shimmer in glass cases, their shapes wide and immaculate, the fabrics arranged in perfect symmetry. They are praised as symbols of refinement, studied for their construction, and admired for their beauty. Yet beneath every preserved fold lies an absence, a silence, shaped by the bodies that once made these silhouettes possible and were never allowed to be seen. Behind the smooth surfaces rests a truth the era preferred to hide. History often embraces what is pleasant to remember and quietly abandons what disrupts the image. The Victorian dress stands as a monument to such selective memory. The visible part is celebrated: the sheen of satin, the intricate stitching, the way fabric cascades into perfect curves. But the invisible cost is left unspoken. It fades into the background of time, even though it was once carried in the cramped posture of a girl pressed beneath metal hoops, supporting the illusion of ease for someone standing above her. Many admired the elegance of these gowns without ever asking how such weight remained lifted, how the shape stayed precise, or who ensured the fabric never collapsed under its own structure. For the maids who endured those conditions, the experience was not extraordinary, it was routine. They learned to hold their breath, to remain unheard, to still their bodies, even when pain settled into their muscles, to accept that their presence existed only as long as they remained invisible. Their labor was not dramatic, not violent, not public. It was a quiet, continuous erasure of self, performed in the service of someone else's appearance. It left no scars that could be photographed, no testimonies written in journals, no documentation that could survive the years. The absence of evidence is not the absence of suffering. It is the mark of a world that chose not to record it. When we look at the dresses today, the craftsmanship is indeed striking. The smooth curve of the skirts, the precision of the seams, the delicate interplay of fabric and structure, all of it speaks of skill and dedication. But behind that artistry lies the silence of those who once crouched in darkness, steadying the fabric with their own bodies. The dresses did not float, someone held them. They did not remain symmetrical, someone shaped them from below. They did not move effortlessly, someone bore the strain to preserve that illusion. Beauty and burden existed together, though only one was allowed to leave a trace in history. Fashion, for all its creativity, can conceal as much as it reveals. In the Victorian era, beauty was defined by rigid structures and even more rigid expectations. The crinoline demanded balance assistance and sometimes a hidden figure beneath it. The corset demanded endurance and often pain. The ideal silhouette required bodies that could be molded or sacrificed. The garments became reflections of a hierarchy in which some people were meant to be displayed as symbols of refinement, while others were expected to disappear inside the machinery of elegance. Yet even erasure leaves echoes. Though their names never appeared in records, the lives of these hidden maids shaped the rituals of their time. Their bodies influenced how dresses were made, how women walked, and how events unfolded. They bore the physical cost of a vision of beauty that never intended to acknowledge them. And though society moved past the practice without recognizing its cruelty, the truth did not vanish. It remains folded into the very structure of the dresses that outlasted the women who supported them. These maids deserve to be spoken of not as footnotes or curiosities, but as human beings whose lives were reduced to silence. Their endurance was not a choice, but a condition imposed by circumstance, necessity, and the expectations of a world built on layered inequalities. To bring their story into the light is not to rewrite the past, but to expand it, to allow the unseen to be part of the narrative that once excluded them. We honor them by acknowledging the weight they carried and the way their bodies became the hidden foundation of beauty. As this journey through the shadows of Victorian fashion draws to a close, it is worth pausing to imagine those forgotten figures stepping out from beneath the fabric. Picture them stretching stiff limbs, inhaling a full breath after hours of restraint, lifting their faces toward open air instead of the underside of a dress. Imagine them becoming visible at last, acknowledged for the endurance that elegance demanded from them. Their silence deserves recognition. Their suffering deserves remembrance. They should have had their names recorded. They should have had their stories preserved. They should not have disappeared simply because their labor supported someone else's illusion. And while we cannot return to the moments when they were erased, we can refuse to let their absence continue unquestioned. Speaking of them now allows their presence to surface faint but real in the collective memory that once pushed them aside. So tonight, as the final words of this story settle into a quiet rhythm, let the truth of their endurance stay with you. Let the dresses in museums shift slightly in your imagination, revealing the cost beneath the beauty. Let the quiet of this moment remind you how many lives throughout history remained hidden simply because the world preferred not to see them. May your rest be gentle, untouched by the burdens these women carried. May the quiet around you feel like acknowledgement rather than erasure, a space where forgotten stories can breathe again. And may those who once lived in the shadows find a place in your thoughts, finally welcomed into the light that history denied them. Good night. May sleep come softly, and may the hidden rest peacefully beside you.